So I want to thank the Arlington Public Library. They're co-sponsor our Monday special events. So this is a Monday special event. Normally our events are at 3 p.m. We're starting at 3:30 today. And I want to thank our special events committee, and especially our chair, Chris McLaughlin, and also the Community Advisory Council of Encore Learning, and Chris Milliken is the chair of that committee, and thank the Chris's for their inspiration to offer this program today via Zoom, so thank you. So this program was planned a while ago and we weren't sure we were going to offer it, so I'm so delighted we are, and it's featuring several members of our Virginia legislature, and a truly historic session. Our moderator, Margaret Whipple, is an individual whose entire adult life has been in service to our community, first as a member of the school board, a member of the Arlington County Board, and then followed by 16 years as our state senator. So as a community, we've benefited so much from your service, Mary Margaret, and I'm just delighted to have you host our panel today, so thank you.
So thank you so much, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Encore Learning special event. When it was titled as a historic legislative event, that is not an overstatement. It was an amazing session. And I think I'll start first with something that I waited 45 years for it to happen, and that was the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, mind you, it's not going to happen right away, but Virginia was the 38th state, and technically that could mean that it will actually happen after a few court cases and things like that. I cannot tell you how excited I was at the General Assembly. First of all, I got in the gallery in the Senate and watched my friend Louise Lucas, who is President Pro Tem of the Senate. And normally the Lieutenant Governor presides, but he graciously stepped aside to let Louise preside over the Senate while they passed the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was just a thrilling moment. And then when both houses passed the legislation, you could hear the cheers throughout the Capitol. So it was an amazing and wonderful thing to happen after all these decades of waiting for it. This leads me to say a word or two about the historic nature of the women in leadership. So not only Louise as President Pro Tem of the Senate, but the very first female Speaker of the House, Eileen Fillercorn from Northern Virginia. The first woman to be a majority leader in the House, Charnel Herring. They chose a new female clerk of the House, the very first time a woman had served in that position. So it's just been, and a number of chairs of committees. So that's just been a very thrilling aspect of this year's session. Also, quite a lot of legislation passed, not just the ERA, but many other bills that we had been working on for years and years. Even a couple that I had put in maybe even 20 years ago. One for no excuse absentee voting. We tried years after year to get that bill, and this year it passed. Or non-discrimination in housing and employment for our LGBTQ community. Things that had been put in and hoped for, but just didn't happen until this very year. Then there were some that we didn't even dare to dream of, like increasing the minimum wage or the gun control bills. So you'll hear more from our panelists about these issues, but I can only say that for me, it was simply wonderful to watch it happen. Then the budget was another area that was very different from previous years because there was more money, there was much more unanimity about how that money could be spent to help Virginians, how we could make up for years and years of underinvestment in programs in Virginia. We had hoped very much to have Janet Howell here this afternoon, who is a chair of the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee, the first woman to serve in that position. She, however, is tied up in calls with the governor and the departments about working on the current reworking of the budget. But I must say that it was very exciting to see additional funding go to colleges and universities, to the environment. I established the Natural Resources Commitment Fund years ago. It had, I think, about 2 cents in it. And now they were recommending $73 million for that fund to help the Chesapeake Bay. And the Housing Trust Fund, with real money in it for the first time, that can help so much. So just many aspects of the budget that were very gratifying to see. Well, you'll hear more from our panelists. And so let me turn first to Barbara Favola. Barbara was elected in 2011, came into the Senate in 2012. And Barbara, as well as our other members of our delegation, are experienced legislators who know the ropes. So we're very fortunate to have them in position when this year came, and there was an opportunity to be in the majority and do so much more. Barbara is chair of the Committee on Rehabilitation and Social Services, and I think she will probably refer to that. So Barbara, let me turn to you.
Oh, thank you, Mary Margaret. And we should say that many of the gains that the women lawmakers made this past year was because of hard work and the accomplishments of people like you. You were the first female caucus chair in the Senate. And so little by little, the leadership ceiling started to crack and women were able to move up. But thank you for your wonderful and stellar work and your leadership when you were in the Senate. You really paved the way for many women, and we're grateful. So we did have a transformational year. It was more than anybody could have hoped for, really, when you think of the progress we made in one session. And I have to say, this was the result of a very positive election in November. If anybody had any doubt about elections mattering, they should be reaffirmed that when people get out and vote and they vote their values, good things can happen. So I will just go over some of the things that were under my rubric, and my colleagues who were all also very successful and very much a part of the transformational change will speak to issues that they're experts in as well. I do serve on Rehab and Social Services. I do serve as chair, and that's a real joy for me because the committee has an interesting scope. One part is the regulation of the Alcohol and Beverage Control Authority, which is the one part of government that's actually flush with funds right now. I guess our alcohol sales have been going up. But other parts of the committee look at social services. And I spent 15 years at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services before I went to local government on the Arlington board. So in my committee, we looked at foster care, and I've been a big advocate of the foster care system and passed many pieces of legislation. This year, we opened the door for funding for guardianship programs before the child goes into foster care or has a diversion, which right now the parents or grandparents really or other relatives are not getting much money at all to care for these children unless the child is actually put into foster care. So we set the framework for that to be a true diversion program. I came up with legislation to allow a victive kin, which would be somebody who has an ongoing relationship with the child, but's not a blood relative, to also step up as a foster parent. And we went on to actually make additional tweaks to our programs to provide a more seamless safety net for our foster youth. Some of the programs you also might be interested in were reentry programs under the Rehab and Social Services Committee. I carried legislation for 8 years, just about. It felt like 8 years, maybe it was 6 years, to try to remove the ban on accessing TANF if you were a convicted felon for a drug felony charge, had done your time, and you were released. we had a ban. We were prohibiting you from accessing TANF, and really the TANF benefits support children. We were able to remove that ban. We were able to remove the ban on accessing food stamps for ex-felons. So those were good programs. Senator Ebbin had a great bill. It was a study bill to ensure that children who are with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, are treated in a culturally sensitive and appropriate way if they reside in our regional detention centers, which some of them do. And I thought that was a great bill. We had bills on ensuring information that, such as somebody's mental health status, is also not only protected, but in a way is shared with the appropriate officials, especially in our criminal justice department, so individuals can get access to mental health services when they're in our jail system. One of the areas that I really made headway in is the healthcare. I passed a bill which folks have been trying to pass for 3 or 4 years, and it wasn't because it was necessarily transformational in a partisan sense. It's a bill that has a lot of stakeholders who are very influential and powerful in Richmond. It was hard to get them together, but I did, and my bill stops surprise medical billing. So if an individual goes for either emergency care or scheduled surgery, and one of the physicians or one of the providers is out of that person's insurance network, the patient will not be expected to pay any additional cost other than what the patient had planned to pay through his or her insurance plan. So I was very proud of that, and that's actually a really big deal. I also serve on local government and transportation. Mary Margaret, you can appreciate this, but I know for years county governments have been trying to get equal taxing authority with cities and towns. When I was the president-elect of VACO, that was our top priority. Finally, we've got a bill through. We're hoping the governor signs it. So that would be great. Now more than ever, counties need different revenue streams. We don't know the full impact of the COVID-19, but we do know we're going to need a lot of different tools to address the hit on our revenues. I also sit on transportation. We passed a major transportation bill this year. I can come back and talk to you about that if that's something the group is interested in. I also served on agriculture and natural resources. So that was a new experience for me, and I really enjoyed it. It was lots of fun getting to vote on environmental bills. And I do want to say I put in a bill to ban polystyrene containers. My bill was rolled into Senator Ebbin's bill, which was perfectly fine. Senator Ebbin was successful in passing a plastic bag prohibition bill, or we worded it another way. It was a tax if you used a plastic bag. And there were some nuances in the bill. It certainly applies to Planning District 8. That was where the mandate would go. And then finally, I sat on the Rules Committee, and that was a great experience as well. I did serve as a whip for the Senate Democratic Caucus, and I had the pleasure of working with very dedicated and like-minded lawmakers who did their best to get major pieces of legislation through. I will stop speaking at this point. I know Patrick Hope can say a lot about the gun safety bills because he chaired a subcommittee on that, and he too was a pleasure to work with, and we worked together on a major immunization bill. So
thank you, Barbara. That was great, a good rundown, and it shows us how involved you are and on so many committees that you can have influence really across the board. And that was a great lead in for Patrick. So why don't we move to Patrick Hope? And he got for the first time to be in the majority this year, and the majority is definitely better, isn't it, Patrick? And he chairs the Committee on Public Safety. Again, a person who's had a lot of years of experience in the General Assembly and was raring to go when the time came. Patrick?
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Yes, being in the majority, that is an understatement. It is much, much better to be in the majority. And yeah. So thank you, and to thank Encore for having this ability to address Arlingtonians about this historic session. I don't think there's really any other way to describe this session. You can come up with other adjectives, but I think this is probably the best describer of this session. It was historic in every aspect. First, we are, to your point, the Democrats in the House. I've never been in the majority before, and this is my sixth term, 11th session in office, and being the majority makes a big difference. I chair the Public Safety Committee. The Speaker of the House, the first female Speaker of the House, tapped me to chair Public Safety Committee, and I'll reserve most of my remarks about that experience. I'm also on the Courts of Justice Committee, which I've been on for 10 years, and I'm on the Health, Welfare, and Institution Committee, which I've been my entire time on the committee in office. And I chaired a subcommittee in healthcare. But I did want to talk about public safety because that got a tremendous amount of attention this session. Although I did speak to several reporters who would say there's just so much going on, we can't cover everything.
Yeah.
But this is one aspect that got a lot of attention, and it's the gun violence prevention. And I think it should have been an indicator that this was going to get so much attention, not just when we took the majority, but if you'll recall, right after a tragedy in Virginia Beach over the summer, and Governor Northam called a special session, and by God, he had a platform that was 8 gun violence prevention bills that have been proven to save lives in other states where it's been used. And the Republican majority during that special session, we were in special session for about an hour and a half. It took me longer to drive down there, and then they adjourned for just an hour and a half after so many people were slaughtered during that tragedy at Virginia Beach. And it became clear at that point that that was going to be an election year platform for the Virginia Democrats in running. And so it should become as no surprise that those bills came back. And they did come back. And there were several others that were introduced, but that became the top priority of our Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And we passed 8 bills out of the House. 7 ended up going to the governor to his desk. And I want to run through the 7 bills. One of the first bills that I think probably is the most popular when you look at polls is passing universal background checks on all firearm sales. And this is the famous closing the gun show loophole that Senator Ebbin, he was a delegate at the time, we went to a gun show in the area, and we both bought weapons. He bought a magazine clip, and I bought a revolver without a background check. It was one of the easiest transactions you'll make, and it was something that we'll be able to close that loophole. The other part of the bills that we introduced and passed was reinstating the law to allow the purchase of only 1 handgun a month over a 30-day period. And if you'll recall, that law was originally in place in the 80s, because back then, a lot of the crimes that were being detected, not just in Washington, D.C., but in the cities of Boston and New York City, most of the guns could be traced back to a gun purchased in Virginia. And that was during Governor Wilder administration, and my predecessor's predecessor carried that bill, Delegate Jim Allman, to restrict purchasing of handguns to 1 handgun a month. Well, in 2012, Republicans were in charge. They repealed that. And so now that we're in charge, this is something that is quite of a surprise to a lot of people, that you can buy as many guns as you want. And this polls very well. And we did pass 1 handgun a month, our second bill. And one of the third bills, though, would require lost or stolen firearms to be reported to law enforcement within 48 hours. A lot of times when a gun is lost or stolen, it usually means that it's going to be used in the commission of a crime, or at least a lot of times it can mean that. And so alerting law enforcement is something that law enforcement has asked us, that having that information would be extremely helpful. Another bill that was passed was called creating an extreme risk protective order that would allow a court to order the temporary separation of firearms from an individual determined to be in danger of themselves or others. This bill was patroned by Delegate Rip Sullivan and passed in the House. And is a really important bill because if you think about an opportunity where someone knows that a loved one is a danger to themselves or others, and if you think about the number of different crimes that are committed or gun violence committed, it's usually by suicide and because guns are involved. And trying to take and remove a firearm out of that situation will save lives. Another bill that passed was prohibiting a person that is the subject of a protective order from possessing a firearm. This bill was patroned by Senator Janet Howe as well too. And so you could imagine that someone that is the subject of a protective order would likely commit crimes. And we've seen that evidence that when you take guns out of those situations, that too will save a lot of lives. Also enhancing the penalty for recklessly allowing child access to a loaded firearm. That means you can't just leave a loaded firearm recklessly around the house or someone can get their hands on it. And that can also end in a tragedy. The other one that I think will have a lot of influence here in Arlington County, and if you remember the situation in Charlottesville about a year and a half ago when white supremacists from all across the country descended on Charlottesville, this was all related to an issue related to removing a Confederate statue in Charlottesville. And Charlottesville became a focal point for a lot of discussion. And what this bill would do is it would be allow localities like Arlington or Charlottesville to prohibit firearms in county buildings, in county parks or recreation centers, or in the circumstance with Charlottesville, when you had a permit that allowed for protests, that you could have certain streets that would be included in that restriction of that protective order to prohibit firearms in a situation like that. So that's something that I think will have a really big effect on Arlington County. The last bill I'll say, and that's 7 bills, and I'll just say this before I mention it, is that any one of these bills in any other session would have probably took up the entire oxygen out of an entire session. But we passed 7 of them, and that is quite an achievement. It's quite an accomplishment. And again, I want to reiterate this point, is that in other states where these 7 provisions are in place, or the law of the land, they've been proven to save lives. But the last one that we didn't quite get over the finish line is an assault weapons ban. And that's just one that we couldn't get past the argument where people were very concerned that it would become a taking, or someone would come in and start confiscating firearms. We tried to water it down a little bit to get to a place where we could get more people comfortable with it. We were able to pass it out of the House just barely, but we weren't able to pass it out of the Senate. And the Senate, a Senate committee sent it to the Crime Commission for study. And the Crime Commission has looked at these things, and I'm hopeful that they'll be able to look at it in short order whenever we're able to meet again, these commissions. I'm hoping they'll make a positive recommendation and the bill will come back. There are a number of different bills that I won't get into, all the different gun violence prevention bills that we did pass. There's a few others that we did pass that we believe will be helpful in saving lives. But this was a big year for gun violence prevention. We certainly were not one of the shining stars in the country in the past on passing gun violence prevention, but we took a big giant step forward in trying to save lives and having some common sense gun laws. And I'm very proud that both the House and the Senate were able to stick together and pass some really important pieces of legislation that we sent to the governor.
So thank you, Patrick. You were absolutely the right person to be there and be the chairman of that committee. And he had some pretty tough hearings to preside over too, but his calm manner prevailed, and so did the will of the people to get all those great bills passed. So that's a real accomplishment in this historic session. Well, Adam, your name has been mentioned a few times. And again, we have an experienced senator, somebody who has been there for a couple of terms and who really knows what how it is to maneuver in the Senate. And of course, I know you too enjoyed being in the majority. So Adam, it's yours.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. This is my 17th year in the General Assembly, and I spent 8 years in the House, some overlap with Patrick Hope. And when I was in the House, I used to always say, after folks would say to me, how can you stand to go down there? And I would say, hey, I'd rather go down there in the minority, learn the rules, and then when we're in the majority, I'll be ready to hit the ground running. I just didn't know that would take 16 years, so I'm glad that we finally made that change. And it really was a change. It's hard to overstate what the new Democratic majority has done in creating a more equitable and forward-thinking Commonwealth. Virginia is waking up from a mixed history in a lot of areas, and I want to thank Patrick and Barbara for being a huge part of that. I mean, we had a real coalition, and I think Patrick understated his role as chairman of the Public Safety Committee. The bills that passed, they weren't slam dunks necessarily, although they should be, in that there's a lot of detail and nuance to these bills, and a lot of people have different concerns about whether it's due process or satisfying people in their region about them. And it's working a tightrope to get them passed in the strongest possible manner. So thanks to Patrick for that. And thank you, Barbara, for all you did on human services and other things. For me, I'll say first that I'm on a number of committees: Finance and Appropriations, which was a great assignment; General Laws and Technology; Privileges and Elections; Commerce and Labor; Transportation; 3 subcommittees and one special committee. And that was more than I could have imagined. And it's quite a lot to keep up with, but it was worthwhile and important to make that policy difference. One of the things I'll mention that I'm really the most proud of is the Virginia Values Act, which is something I've been working on in one form or another for 16 years off and on, or longer, before I got to the General Assembly. Senator Whipple mentioned the work she had done on the Senate side on housing and state employment non-discrimination. But we added in a new component. We added in private employment as well as public accommodations, which makes us the first state in the South to have such a comprehensive bill passed, and it's on the governor's desk now. Was also really happy to pass marijuana decriminalization, something I've been working on for a few years, and the bill that Senator Favola mentioned, the bag bill, just a little bit different nuance, in that anywhere a state can enact it to have a 5-cent fee in their area. Originally, it was going to be Planning District 8, but we're able to expand that just a little bit wider. So that's a little bit about what I was involved in. I'll say that Delegate Hope had the most controversial bill of the session that got us the most letters and calls, just to mandate, to adjust a mandate on vaccines. But who would have thought, you know, if you had a big disease, like maybe a pandemic, that some people would want to have vaccination. But Patrick made sure that our phone got a good workout. I will say that was just one of the 3001 substantive bills. And he had another bill regarding LGBT rights that I know Patrick's been working on for a while, which is to ban conversion therapy. I co-chair our gun violence prevention caucus. There wasn't much to add to what Patrick said, but I did want to talk just a little bit about election reform. No excuse absentee voting. I had introduced in the House for when I first got there, and Senator Whipple mentioned she had it as well. That's important, and it'll be available for 45 days prior to an election, the same time that absentee voting is, effective July 1st. We are going to have a veto session with the governor, and I'm hoping people will ask about that, about what happens when we go back down there. I think it's on April 22nd, to bills that the governor may have amended or vetoed, because he could take that same bill and make it an emergency bill, an emergency clause bill. And if that was passed, that would mean in the presidential primary, I'm sorry, the June 9th primary, not the presidential primary, that people could vote for any reason absentee, make it real clear. Right now, there's an excuse they can use, but it'd be nice to have that more clear. We also repealed the photo ID requirement. We said that in 2022, we'll have same-day voter registration. We passed a constitutional amendment to send it to the voters on redistricting reform. And then we made Election Day a state holiday instead of Lee Jackson Day. I've actually had constituents say, why is the DMV closed on this particular day in January? And I was embarrassed, ashamed to tell them it was actually Lee Jackson Day. But now we will have Election Day as a state holiday in future years. So that's a little bit about what happened. I'll mention just one or two others in that the transportation bill that Senator Favola mentioned will raise the gas tax 5 cents a year for 2 years, then index to the consumer price index. We will implement a regional gas tax in all parts of Virginia that don't currently have them. We're going to restore money to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, which is important because there was money from there taken to Metro. And we will double the capacity of the Long Bridge over the Potomac. That's from Crystal City to DC. That'll help VRE as well as Amtrak. That bridge was built in the Teddy Roosevelt administration, so we're going to update it with 2 more tracks. And the last one I'm going to mention, lest I take too much time, is the minimum wage. Right now on the governor's desk, there's a bill that would raise the minimum wage to 31% January 2021, and then ratchet it up to $12 by 2023. So that's where I'll conclude. There's lots more to talk about, so I'm looking forward to the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. That was a great rundown. And those election reforms are just amazing. I think we're all very excited about that. And I didn't know if you wanted to add any words about the budget since you are on Senate
Sure.
Finance. Just,
Okay.
Just a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we passed a lot of important things in the budget, including more money for pre-K, raises for teachers, raises for state employees, modest bonuses for sheriffs. And the big issue or the big problem is now we're not going to have the money to spend on all those things. And the governor will have to come up with some substantial amendments to the budget to figure out how it's all going to balance out with decreased tax revenues and increased social services needs like we've never seen before. So we don't know yet what's going to happen in the budget. And your guess is as good as mine. But healthcare is an important need. Hospitals will need money, as will local governments. And some of the regular things are not as dire for a few months as they might be. But almost everything you can think of goes on. When I say are not as dire, I'm just meaning our air pollution because no one's driving to work. But that's not really a budget concern.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, we'll, I'm sure, have some questions about that. And Laura, I think we're ready for questions. If you could give us the first one.
Great. Well, we did just have a question and an update. Actually, Jay Fizette was joining us, and he asked about he talked about his work on the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And now that Virginia's moving forward, clean energy powering our electric grid, to hear more about that work and any comments on the bill and what it accomplishes.
Sure.
Adam?
If it's okay, I'll just start. I think Patrick may have mentioned that Delegate Sullivan, sponsored that legislation in the House and had a lot of important components. And former board member Jay Fissette, who brought up the question, was down in Richmond advocating for that a lot. But the bill proposes reaching carbon emissions of 0 by 2045, expanding job opportunities in the former coal mining communities, expanding offshore wind and solar energy, increasing distributed clean energy generation, expanding net metering, and it goes on and on. Dramatically expanding rooftop solar. So these are a lot of the things that people have been working for years, in addition to the Solar Freedom Act. So very happy to see that move through, and I don't know if there are others who want to add.
Patrick or Barbara want to add to that, or you? Yes, Barbara.
Thanks. Senator McClellan carried that legislation in the Senate. And I know I was chief co-patron on that. And I don't know, Senator Ebbin, you may have been a patron as well. So it really does expand solar, and it gives a lot of incentives to do that. And there are also some incentives, of course, to actually close our coal producing operations, which actually precipitated quite a bit of debate on the Senate floor. So we're hoping that the governor does sign that bill. I think there's a heavy debate now, at least from the letters I'm getting. Some of the business groups don't want any changes to the status quo. They're coming back with their same old arguments about let's not cost any jobs. So I think if people care about that bill, they need to let it be known, and they need to talk to the governor about it.
Okay, great. Good advice.
And I would just add, Mary Margaret, I mean, this is one of those historic bills. It's in a once in a generation shift when it comes to our protecting our environment, and all the different elements that Senator Ebbin mentioned are things that we've been, and advocates have been working on for years. This is one of those examples where either you think we went too far or we didn't go far enough. Right. But by setting a target date of 2045, and who knows whether that can be actually done sooner, and we hope it can be done sooner. But the idea that you would put our regulations and some real investment behind solar and wind and renewable energy and shifting away from the fossil fuels industry, I think is an enormous accomplishment. And it really sets Virginia in the right direction. And it really starts to bring us up on equal footing with other states in this region. It's a long time in coming, and it's probably one of the most consequential pieces of legislation that we've passed this session for sure, and probably in a generation.
Yeah, kudos to everyone on that one. That was absolutely great. Laura, do we have another question?
Yeah, we have two voting related questions, so I'm going to ask them both. One is related, was directed towards Barbara Favola, the status of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact Act. And then secondly, an update on the anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment. So folks want to comment on those. Thank you.
So Adam, do you want to pick up on those questions?
Well, yeah, and I think the and Barbara addressed them as well, but I can start. I sponsored the National Popular Vote bill in the Senate. And for those that don't know what it is, it says rather than just using Virginia's electoral votes for the Virginia winner, that along with a group of states that surpass 270 electoral votes, if that's not too wonky, they would vote for the popular vote winner, ensuring that the next president were the winner of the popular vote. That bill has gained a lot of traction around the country, but not yet in Virginia to pass. The stand right now is that the House version of the bill will be heard if there's an interim meeting between now and January. So if not, it'll come again next year. I pulled my Senate bill when we didn't have the votes for it. Delegate Mark Levine put his forward, and that may yet get heard. And I'll let the others address the constitutional amendment. I will just say one thing that's important to remember. Even though I support the constitutional amendment, it is not an anti-gerrymandering amendment, and it does not call for an independent commission. It's a bipartisan amendment or a bipartisan commission that makes sure that different maps can't be forced upon the other party. It's the way I would portray it. And I could talk more about it, but perhaps Barbara and Patrick would like to address it.
I can add to Senator Ebbin's remarks. Can I go ahead?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh,
you're
okay. Oh, all right. Yeah, the constitutional language, though, does come right out and say that there shall not be gerrymandering based on racial or ethnic or any other, which you would consider any other basis that would be in violation of the Voter Rights Act, the National Voter Rights Protection Act. So that would be in the language before the voters in November 2020. And then the constitutional language, the language before the voters were referred to another section of the amendment that actually goes through a whole litany of an independent redistricting commission would be established with 16 members and 8 members appointed by the General Assembly, 4 members from each body, and then those members would be split between the 2 major governing parties. And then a retired panel of circuit court judges would appoint the experts who would be the other 8 members. And this commission, there's language in there about transparency, and meetings would be held in public. Everything would be out in the open. They would go through a deliberative process, come up with objectively drawn maps, and then they would be sent to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly would only have an up or down vote option. So we would not be able to tweak it. Is it, you know, will those maps sometimes at some point be questioned or subject to a lawsuit? Yes, but I think just about anything anybody does with redistricting, whether it's intended to be nonpartisan or not, will probably be subject to a lawsuit. So I just think it's really important to have something in our Constitution. A criteria bill also passed. Senator McClellan was the patron on that. I was the chief co-patron. And that criteria bill, again, further outlines the fact that districts need to be contiguous and districts can't disadvantage a minority group. And so it's very specific in a way that I think would guide a good deliberative process.
Well, I'll just chime in because I'm the outlier here, and this was a tough vote, and I voted against it, and I joined 45 of my colleagues in the House on the Democrats, our caucus, to vote against it. And like I said, this was probably the toughest vote that I've taken in my 11 years in office, and I was a yes vote up until about 24 hours before. And if you think about all the different issues that we talked about in this session and trying to get alignment as a caucus, we probably spent the most time debating this particular issue. We probably devoted 10 or 12 hours at least as a caucus just on this issue, and members got to speak their minds. And I just sat there and I listened the entire time. And it wasn't until 24 hours before that I changed my mind from a yes to I know. And the reason why is because I became convinced, and everything that Senator Favola said is absolutely 100% correct. And those are the elements of the bill. I just feel like we can do better. And the thing that I had always campaigned on, and I know that One Virginia 2021, which was one of the groups that was organized, and I've had them come to my fundraisers in the past, and I've always supported what they've done. They've always had the principle that we want a nonpartisan and independent commission. And this constitutional amendment, in my view, does not accomplish either of those aspects. And I just felt like we needed to have something to vote for. We wanted to vote for something. And we did put a substitute on the floor that did accomplish an independent and a nonpartisan redistricting. And that's what I wanted to vote for. Unfortunately, that did not pass. And I ended up voting against this one. But I think everyone, I know and love and respect Democrats that have supported this bill. We can look at the same set of facts and just come up with a different conclusion. I just felt like it felt short. And if you're going to amend the Constitution, I wanted to amend it correctly and do it in the right way. And there's nothing to say that you can't amend the Constitution once every 10 years. You can do it every couple of years. And that's what we want to do. This is before the voters right now. And of course, if the voters support it, then it will be in our Constitution, and that's how we will draw lines. But I prefer to wait to get it right and amend our Constitution in a way that's truly independent and truly nonpartisan. Senator Favola mentioned the 8 people that are going to be the elected officials that are going to be named from the House and the Senate. 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And that obviously makes this not nonpartisan by its definition. I can't pick, if you pick 4 Republicans, I could not name for you a single Republican in the House of Delegates that would vote to not send that resolution or that the lines to the Virginia Supreme Court. And that's what people are most concerned about. It really does likely draw it to make sure the Virginia Supreme Court, who is handpicked by Republicans in the past on the Virginia Supreme Court to draw the lines. I will just say this, the criteria legislation that did pass the House and the Senate, it went to conference committee and it didn't come out. It died in conference. And so we didn't get a chance to vote on it. And so we're going to have to figure out that it'll be after the constitutional amendment goes before the voters. We still don't know what the criteria is going to be on how people get selected to this body, the citizen body or the elected official body. We don't know if it does go to the Virginia Supreme Court, how those lines will be drawn. So there's a lot of questions that we still have unanswered. But this is before the voters in a referendum. And so we'll just see how that turns out.
Can I just
Thank
add
you.
one thing?
Go ahead, Barbara.
Sorry, and I will be quick. I would just say, Patrick, we can go back in our session in 2021 and January, February, before we actually do draw the lines and go at it, come up with, again, maybe some enabling legislation that addresses some of your concerns after the constitutional amendment passes. I expect it is going to pass. But I understand there's some value in having some specifics outlined by the General Assembly.
If I were a voter, I would want to know that before I voted yes or no on the amendment.
Yeah, I understand. I took a different tactic, and I will further say that historically the courts have not drawn lines. They have been very diligent about keeping their role and allowing the legislature to actually make the decision on the line. So in the past, courts have always deferred to experts in terms of coming up with a new map, if that was their charge. So there you go. Two thoughtful people and analyzing the facts, and we'll see what happens. But I certainly respect Delegate Hope's view.
It's a perfect illustration of how complicated it is to draft and achieve good legislation. And one of the problems with the constitutional amendment was that it has to be adopted 2 years in a row in exactly the same form. And so the bill had been adopted the previous year, and that sort of tied people's hands about whether it could be changed a little bit or not. And led to more of a dilemma in deciding whether or not to support it.
And there were some major groups that very much backed the constitutional amendment. One Virginia 2021, the League of Women Voters, AAUW, and there's and there the Eric Holton's group, our former Attorney General under Obama. He has a group that was supportive of the constitutional amendment. So I think Patrick's point, very reasonable people can disagree on this.
Yeah, thank you all for that very good discussion. Laura, or do you have another question?
Yeah, I think we're going to take a couple of questions and then move to the hot topic that we had talked about. But somebody asked a good question about if you could talk more about the Republican support that you were able to get on some of the bills that allowed them to pass after years of trying to get them passed.
Well, I'll start a bill that Senator Ebbin mentioned that I've been working on for about 7 years, and that's to ban conversion therapy. And a lot of these bills would never see the light of day out of a subcommittee if you could even get a hearing. And once we got the majority, we knew that we could not only get a hearing, but we could get it out of subcommittee, and then we could get it to full committee, and then you could get it to the floor. And once you got a bill to the floor, where in the House, all 100 members got an opportunity to vote, then people were free to we actually knew where people stood on the subject. And we picked up about 10 or 12 Republican votes in the House on the conversion therapy bill that I couldn't even get out of subcommittee for the last 7 years.
Mhm.
So, and there's a lot of examples. I think gun violence prevention had a lot of examples of bills that got some bipartisan support on some bills. If we could just get it out of subcommittee. ERA is another great example where you had Republicans support the bill when you could finally get it to the floor for a vote. So being in the majority changed all of that. It freed people up, and we got a chance to finally get people to allow them to vote their conscience. And as a result, we saw a lot of bills that had been pent up for years and years and years. Once they finally made it to the floor, you suddenly realized that there was bipartisan support for them. And that was a good feeling to see that.
I just want to add to that. In the Senate, we picked up 2 seats, but we had a couple of seats that we came very close to picking up. One in Virginia Beach and one in the Hanover area. This was where Senator Donovan is the current incumbent. So we had very competitive races in those 2 districts. And it really sort of showed some of the Republican lawmakers who were in these moderate districts that some of the ideas that we came forward with had broad-based support, not just your traditional Democratic base, but some broad-based support. Universal background checks, we picked up Republican support in the Senate. And also, I had a bill on the Gun Violence Prevention Education Fund, and that, had a lot of bipartisan support. The healthcare stuff had bipartisan support, but that doesn't usually break between Democratic and Republican. That's a very common kind of issue. Everybody needs healthcare. Everybody gets sick. So folks sort of figured that out. We do get bipartisan support on education issues traditionally.
Good. Well, and I do think that Patrick's illustration happens in the Senate as well, that things got out of committee that might not have in previous years. And go ahead, Barbara. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I apologize profusely.
No,
Senator Ebbin's not on here, but he should be very proud. I mean, it really warmed my heart to see, this major anti-discrimination bill pass with lots of bipartisan support. And it was really a landmark bill, prohibiting discrimination in housing and workplace and, religious institutions, across the whole gamut. And it was very, very heartening.
Yeah. Adam, what you might want to chime in?
Sure. There are a number of bills that in the Senate that were able to get really a large bipartisan support. One of them was my marijuana decriminalization bill. Went very well. I don't think it was a majority of Republicans, but it was one short of a majority of Republicans. The Virginia Values Act that Barbara was just referring to, I've had a slimmed down version of that, just the state government or government unemployment for a number of years, with really good Republican support from Senator Emmett Hanger, Senator John Cosgrove, people from conservative districts who you might be surprised to see support from. One that was just overwhelming, though, was a bill that I put in a number of times. Senator Bill Stanley put it in first this year, so it was Senate Bill number 1, which was for non-payment of driving offenses, or not driving offenses, non-payment of court costs, that you wouldn't lose your driver's license. That was overwhelming in the Senate. But then there's other bills that don't go as well, whether it's the plastic bag bill that Barbara referred to, or the same-day voter registration, gun safety measures, or raising the minimum wage, where there's just a great divide on the parties, where Democrats are for something, Republicans are on the other side, or whether you need an ID to vote. We saw that before when the Republicans were in control, and now we see it the opposite way with Democrats in control, with a great divide. I'll tell you, if there's people interested, we are pretty transparent with our debates are archived and they're broadcast live on the internet, and you can watch a lot of this streaming, or all of it, and see a good debate and see how we're going about things.
Good, thanks so much. And Laura, did you have one more?
I have one more question. If I'd like to address the topic of vaccine legislation that has passed.
Oh, well. Patrick, do you want to start or you want Barbara?
Yeah, I'm glad
You.
to start. I mean, Barbara, I sort of handed the reins off to her in the Senate. Boy, this is the hardest I've worked on a bill my entire life. And you know, I mentioned the gun violence prevention bills, and we got a lot of, our phone lines were lit up. And of course, that turned very concerning because a number of our members got death threats, and where Arlington Police and Capitol Police were monitoring not just social media, but certainly our homes as well too. All committee members got some really heated areas. But I will tell you, the gun violence people have nothing on the anti-vaxxers. Those guys are coming out in force. They're very organized. They came to every single meeting with their children. They must have had 100 people come out every opportunity that they had. Under current law, what says is we kind of have an opt-in approach whenever a new vaccine is approved by the Centers for Disease Control. And so they determine whether a vaccine is safe, it's effective, and it will save lives. And if that's the criteria, then they will approve it and mandate it for, require it, suggest that it be required for children. Well, because we have this system where it's an opt-in, if you have to bring in a bill that has the suggestion from the CDC before it gets added to the code. And so if you look at our code, it's listed all the different vaccines that have been approved. Well, because of that, Republicans have not allowed any new vaccines to be adopted since 2008. And so as a result, we're missing out on HPV for boys, meningitis, hepatitis, and rotavirus. All these things can not cause cancer, but can kill you as well too. And so what I decided to do is rewrite the bill and say, hey, look, instead of this being an opt-in approach, let's make it an opt-out approach so that anytime the CDC approves a new vaccine, that's automatically included. And if a member of the General Assembly for some reason didn't want to approve a life-saving vaccine, they could introduce a bill and get it taken out. And so I got the bill passed through the House, and the Senate was a much harder effort. Of course, it was all party line vote the entire way. But in the end, we did prevail. And actually, there was one exception in the Senate. I'll let you talk about that, Senator Favola. But we were able to get it to a place where we've now leave the decision to the Virginia Department of Health to take the recommendations from the CDC. The reason why it's so relevant is because we hope and we pray that there will be a vaccine at some point in time for coronavirus. And when the FDA or the CDC determines that the vaccine is safe, it's effective, it will save lives, we want that to be automatically part of our vaccine schedule. And so we don't want to have to come to the General Assembly during a session and ask for permission to get that added to the list. So it's very pertinent to where we are today. I'll let Senator Favola talk about what she had to do in the Senate to make sure that that bill survived. But it survived, and it's on the governor's desk right now. And so we're very hopeful that he's going to sign it, and it's going to save lives. I think that there's one bill that you can point to that you absolutely certain is going to save lives. Boy, apropos to this situation we're in today, it's going to do it.
Barbara?
Well, the fine bill that came over from the House was, I think, significantly weakened when it got out of committee in Ed and Health. And so I had to amend the bill on the floor of the Senate to ensure that, again, the CDC suggested best practice list for vaccines be incorporated in the state Board of Health list. And that's very important because if we do have it in the State Board of Health, then the state has the authority to purchase the vaccines in bulk and to actually distribute them to our local health departments. So it is a real way of providing a seamless opportunity for the entire Commonwealth to have access to vaccines that are recommended by the CDC. Now, mind you, you still, a doctor or a healthcare professional still has to go through all the criteria to determine if you're appropriate to get the vaccine, and has to do an assessment and look at your health status. So all of those things are still in play and should be. But I think Patrick's point that at least we're adopting the CDC best practice list sort of proactively is a really good thing. And we had an individual, one Republican walked, and then one voted with us. And we passed it out, but it was a robust conversation. And I fear that this vaccine issue is becoming one of those very divisive lines, and it shouldn't be, between the two parties. Because again, we're talking about health and the public health. Because you can respect, if a family member wants to opt out and does not want their child vaccinated, that is the family member's choice. We are not changing any parental rights here. So parents still has the option of opting out and not accepting the vaccine. We're not changing that. But we just have an obligation to say that other people can be affected by this decision. So we're going to go forward and say this is the right thing to do, and you make your decision, you parent make your decision in that context.
Okay, yeah, that's a very, very good point, that there's still that right exists for those who feel that way. Well, we're certainly in the middle of our public health emergency right now, and so we very much appreciate you all being with us today and being willing to do it by Zoom. That is, we're learning new ways so that we can all stay at home, wash our hands, sing happy birthday twice, and
wear our masks.
Carry on.
Social distancing, Mary Margaret, does not mean being in outer space.
Okay, I'll bear that in mind. I don't have to distance that far. All right. Do you all have any concluding remarks you'd like to make at this point?
I will just say, and I don't want to put a damper on things, but all our good work everything is being evaluated. The governor, and I guess Senator Ebbin can speak up on this too, but the governor sent a notice out to agency heads. They have to identify any new initiatives, any enhancements to existing programs, all of the very fine, progressive, much needed funding that we had put into our budget is now going to be called into question just to support basic safety net programs like unemployment insurance and to help our small businesses. And, Aubrey Lane is saying for the next biennium.
And who's Aubrey Lane?
Oh, he's our state treasurer. So he is, in effect, he's the top dog in charge of our putting together the state budget, monitoring our finances, and advising the governor on revenue.
Secretary of Finance.
Secretary of Finance, yeah.
Good.
So, I mean, he thinks that over the next 2 years, it could cost us as much as a $2 billion hit to our budget. Because, the economy, if it takes months to come back, that's a significant loss of revenue. And Senator Ebbin will tell you, I mean, if combined our reserves and our rainy day fund equal about $2 billion, but we can't deplete them completely because there are some, bond rating agencies like you to have things in reserve and all that. So we really don't know what the budget is going to look like. And I can just say that the Arlington delegation and the 3 members here, and particularly, are working very hard to make sure that we're going to take care of our Virginians and to do the right thing and to not leave our vulnerable folks behind.
Yeah. Adam, why don't you pick up, and then we'll see if Adam comes back
Sure.
on.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a briefing last night from Secretary Lane, and I understand that Senator Favola's point that they're going to be looking at all those bills for what we call our House Bill 30 for future years, for the next year or two, are going to be put on hold, where we can come and evaluate, because we need to figure out, first of all, what the federal government is going to give to states as stimulus. And we also need to fully understand the impact of the pandemic. A lot of people have lost their jobs. Some businesses may not be able to come back. It's going to be a huge loss to the Commonwealth. And it's just something that we're just going to have to help people in the short term, recognize that people are truly suffering, and whether it comes for providing them unemployment insurance, helping small businesses, help people get back on their feet. Governor Northam says this better than anyone. we're facing two different crises. We're facing a public health crisis and we're facing an economic crisis. And we can't solve the economic crisis until we first get past the public health crisis. So that's what we need to do as Virginians, and make sure we adhere to all those requirements that only go out for only essential purposes only. If you have to go out, wear a mask, practice social distancing, don't touch your face. And when you come home, make sure you wash your hands frequently. And if we do all those things as Virginians and we band together, we'll get through this together, and then we can start focusing on the economic recovery. I do think the fundamentals are there that we can recover, but it's going to take several months in order to get there, maybe a little bit more than a year to get back to where we were. But I think that Virginians show resolve, and we're always up to the challenge, and I believe we will do that.
Thank you all so much. This has been so interesting, I'm sure, to all of our audience. And while we hate to end on a downer at the end, honestly, it's what's dominating all our thoughts and actions at this point. So we appreciate your good advice and thoughts on that issue as well. So thank you again. And then Laura, did you want to close out?
Yeah, I'm sorry we lost you. So if Adam wants to add a couple moments, and then I'll close with a couple of announcements.
Okay, Adam, we lost you in there. So if you want to pick up and just a couple of concluding remarks.
Thank you. So before I got bumped for my computer running out of power, Senator Favola pretty much hit all the notes in that raises that we've been able to designate for education professionals, for state employees, anything that's new at all in the budget. The federal government is going to give us money, but it's not going to be enough. I might differ in that I'm very hopeful that we don't cut unemployment. Thus far, it's been raised because of the federal government. And while we do have the biggest reserves ever, we are not going to recover from this easily. Our economy is not going to, when we're sheltering in place, our social distance is ended and we can go back to work, it's not going to be easy as can be to start. So I'm not as optimistic about our short-term economy, but I am glad to see that Virginia's economy has diversified so much more. We're good in that we're getting a better mix between the federal government and private business and technology. And this is one case where it is great to have the federal government and so many military in Virginia not losing their payroll.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for that. And again, thanks to all of you for participating in the Encore Learning Panel. And I'll turn it over to Laura.